What are we not seeing? It's an impossible question to ask. To ask you that, I must first ask my heart that question. What am I not seeing? What is I? What is heart? Last spring, I was invited to attend a Legacy of Slavery tour at Harvard that some of the chaplains of Harvard College led and built. And I went with the EDI office that I've been working at, specifically the Office of BGLTQ Student Life. We all went as a group. I was a little nervous because sometimes you don't know how the dynamics are gonna go. And I was so happy to see a friend of mine from Divinity School there. It was the last tour that he'd give before going off to Divinity School himself. He was an undergrad. So I knew I was in good hands. What I didn't expect was on our second stop, or maybe it was the third, I think it was the third. We started off in Harvard Yard. We walked a bit to one of the houses on this row, and we took time for reflection, history, and sitting, except I was generally just lying on the grass by the second time. That's what my body wanted to do. I knew I looked crazy to some of, I'm there with Harvard admin, but there's no way for me to, if I was to take that seriously, I needed to move my body how it needed to be in processing, authentically. I found a side of it. I didn't do it right in the middle. I'm not prostrating myself on the ground. It would have been, in other situations applicable, not here. Sadly, maybe. So I get to the third stop, and I think it was in Radcliffe Yard, which those of you who are familiar with the area, it's a few streets down that way, a couple streets down, and then you go into this open green area. Well, it's enclosed by a bunch of buildings. And when we get into the yard, the name Elizabeth Cabot Carey Agassiz came up. And actually, I think I saw her name on the building, which is now the admissions building of Harvard College. That's where folks first go, I guess, when they want to, I know that's where their applications go for the college. But they start talking about her history, and I knew it because in a class earlier that year, I had played Elizabeth Cabot Carey Agassiz in this in grade school they have you do model museums. Had anyone had you do that? You have to kind of embody, take the character of someone and kind of embody that, learn about their history. Living museum. Well, you can do that in grad school too, apparently. And I'll share a bit of that history with you all. But I think what's more salient for me is that a central question came up. Just from my heart, sitting there at the steps. I wasn't laying down at this point. I was sitting. My body wanted to move a different way. But sitting at the steps of this building that was named after her, after this woman who had done all this work to advance access to education. And I stumble here because it was for white women. It wasn't for all women. It was for wealthy white women. And we know this. It's no secret or surprise, but what I think did start stirring my heart there was that what I also knew is that I was standing on the ground or sitting on these marble steps. I think they're marble, built in her honor, and she was Unitarian. She did all this great work, and yet helped to cover up some of her husband's history, some of her own history, in the name of legacy, in the name of his name. And that made me start asking, what am I not seeing in this work that I'm doing in Unitarian spaces? Because her family, established Unitarian family. They went to another congregation. I don't believe this one. Maybe they probably did come here, but they were parishioners primarily at a congregation elsewhere. But she lived in Cambridge, and she had a lot of influence and a lot of connections. So that's really the root of where all this begins for me. As part of First Parish's commitment to reckoning with our Unitarian history, we are considering not only the life and legacy of Elizabeth Cabot Carey Agassiz, but we consider our own lives and positionalities. And maybe what kind of connection, if any, do we have to her story or someone else's that moves you? As I referenced, she was a wife and close collaborator of Louise Agassiz, who she met at church. He was married, and then he wasn't, and then they got married and had some children. He was a biologist and a geologist whose approach to teaching did revolutionize the study of natural history. His approach was that largely of using specimens and looking at these specimens instead of solely looking at it from history books, science books. I'm personally grateful for some of his work and the work that his son continued. Because of that, I've had access to some coral specimens that I've worked on in some of my own work, trying to look at coral in Cuba, where my family is from. Yet, in my own work with the coral, I feel very divided. I've never been to Cayo Coco, which is where one of the pieces of coral is from and where my grandfather used to dive. So that's the closest that I can ever get to, as of now, to that reef. But it's also part of a practice that it's extractive. And something that we have to thank scholars like Stephen Jay Gould for is that in the 70s, they started bringing up these other elements and questioning some of the history of Agassiz's relationship with categorization of people, because his scholarship also advanced theories in support of scientific racism. His wife, she was extremely well educated. Her parents made sure of that. And she was also very disciplined and loved learning. It wasn't just a business that they were starting, or she was starting out of her home, because that's where the annex, what would become Radcliffe, that's where it started. But she loved letters, and she edited his works. So I got really angry out there on Radcliffe Yard last spring. I didn't want to talk to anyone or the people I wanted to talk to. I mean, I didn't want to talk about how my dog was or how the day was going. Like, this was not time for chit chat. Like, this was time to feel. So that made me more angry. I've been working through the anger, primarily because this calls me, anger can achieve a lot. Anger can be a spiritual discipline. There's a great book called Love and Rage by Lama Rod Owens, and it's important to consider. Yet I was asking myself for something different that comes after my anger, sometimes alongside it. But this spiritual humility of, instead of judging this woman and then judging myself, coming in and thinking and feeling, what might it have looked like to be in her position? And what tools could she have benefited from that she didn't have? Or maybe she had them and chose to turn away as a matter of expediency, of choosing which donor would be most beneficial to her aims of establishing this college. There was a lot of pushback several times. They did not want her learning annex to turn into a college. But she got donations. She had wealthy people who wanted their own daughters to be educated. And the house that actually I live in right now was built in 1906, so a few decades after this work of hers had begun. But it was the first Radcliffe dormitory. Outside of these boarding houses, it was like this official dormitory. And it's a beautiful building, and I'm really grateful to live there as a resident tutor. And I wonder if that's also why I felt this deeper, visceral kind of response to stepping on that ground that day. I guess what I'm asking today is when we're looking at the history of those who came before us, or people who we're walking alongside now, what does it say about our own humanity and humanness? We all bring gifts, and we all make huge mistakes, but that doesn't give us the right, and I think many of us know this now, to erase the reality of the histories. It doesn't give us the right to turn away. If not, that's a further perpetuation. Because how we treat our ancestors is how we treat ourselves, our children, and as fellow congregant and colleague Nina Litton tells me, our children and grandchildren. I made a mistake in the blurb today. I used the word reconciliation. And Nina tells me it's not reconciliation. It's honoring. We are the descendants of our ancestors and the ancestors of our descendants. In Western culture, many of us may need to reconsider and heal the intergenerational family systems. This morning's walk to First Parish, I made a detour. I made a right on Garden Street a bit earlier than I usually would have, or off of Garden Street. I came up to the Radcliffe Yard again and walked towards that building I spoke to you of. I just looked. I breathed and looked. And as I was getting ready to leave, I paused again. And I said, "Thank you," as I was looking at Agassi's name. I said, "I'm sorry for your suffering." She was human. We all suffer, humans, every one of us. And then I said, "We can do better." That "we" was fascinating to me because it shifted in a way when I said it. By thanking her, by extending compassion, and acknowledging that I was part of her history, too. This afternoon, after we hopefully have some time here together after the service, I will be continuing some of this work with First Parish in Cambridge, the United Church of Christ Church. Is it not United Church of Christ? UCC? UCC, yeah. Oh, First Church. Okay, thank you. Which initially was, this church was part of that, both congregations were together at one point. There's ongoing work on this history and on what I call this heart work, and I'm not the only one who calls it heart work. I just like to remind myself and people in these spaces that it is, because it's very easy to just get into the intellectual. So it's work that, in order to be of use to, I'm not just saying this congregation, but those we interact with in our lives, people at home, ourselves on our own spiritual journeys, or those who don't like the word spiritual, our own life's journey. It's work that has to be personal. If we are to believe that in our bodies that the personal is political, then the political has to be personal. I'm going to share some language as I close that was inspired from the First Church of Jamaica Plain Unitarian Universalists. Welcome. And I had the honor of visiting them last month. And we have our land acknowledgement in the beginning of the service. But I think we're being called to, and we've been called for a long time, whether we've seen it or heard it or felt it, to move beyond just an acknowledgement. The language here is, our community is beginning the work of reparation for this history, or has begun it already and is now ready to return. We are not yet sure what the work will entail, but we can begin by learning and telling our real history, or I would even say, histories. We invite you to this work and bring your open heart, your ideas, and your commitment. I'm so grateful to the people of this congregation, the racial equity team, the work that's been done on the Legacy of Slavery project and ensuing work, and the people who want to take risks together to feel. So I ask you again, not just what are we not seeing, but whom? Whose stories? How about in our own selves? As a community of faith guided by, and I hope dedicated to the difficult, hard work of justice. Amen.